Next on AM 1480 WLEA, The Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Here we go this morning live with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Well, Dr. Ostrower, the History.com has an interesting This Day in History page, and looking through this day in 1967, Belgian department store burns, killing 322 people. They say poor preparation and safety features were responsible for the high death toll. On this day in history in 1964, the Vietnam War, Secretary of State Dean Rusk in 1964 warned the North Vietnamese of initiating and directing aggression in South Vietnam. And Rusk says U.S. withdrawal would not only mean grievous losses to the free world in the Southeast and Southern Asia, and then he continued on. Your thoughts on what Dean Rusk there said back on this day in history in 64?
Well, I guess it just proves that often high-level officials have no idea what they're talking about. Dean Rusk warned that if we removed our troops, there'd be massacres and so forth. Well, we didn't remove our troops, and there were massacres. It was a very, very unpleasant experience, and it was an experience that we never should have endured in the first place. It was a war that I think most historians, the vast majority of historians today, would agree should never have been fought, at least not by the United States. And the reason is simply that there were no vital American interests at risk. In other words, we know what happened after the war. The North Vietnamese won the war. Vietnam was unified by the communist government, and today Vietnam is a major trading partner of the United States. We have American corporations all over Vietnam. One would never know that it was a hostile regime to begin with. We didn't have to fight a war to discover that.
Dr. Ostrower, kind of curious, you teach courses on the histories of wars. Do you ever talk to any of the local Vietnam vets on what you were just talking about, on the necessity for the Vietnam War?
I often do. I teach a course called America in Vietnam. I have brought in Vietnam vets every single time that I've taught the course. And
what do they say?
This goes back about 30 years or so.
Sure.
And I sponsored, not sponsored, but I organized just this year, earlier this year in February, a forum at Alfred University to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. I brought in 4 speakers, all of whom were veterans, and interestingly, all of whom would basically agree with what I just said in respect to the desirability of being there, the necessity to be there. But yeah, I think that using first-person experience as a teaching tool, it can be very, very valuable.
Now, we are going to get to current events. I did have a couple more This Day in Histories. This Day in History, 1969, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge at the Paris Peace Talks says he finds common grounds for discussion in the proposals for President Nixon and the National Liberation Front. Tell us about that.
Well, the National Liberation Front was the fancy name for the Viet Cong. Those are the guerrillas in the South who were fighting against the South Vietnamese government. And then, of course, you also had the North Vietnamese government joining with the National Liberation Front, joining with the Viet Cong against the U.S. and the South Vietnamese. So it was, something of a complicated situation there. But the statement that you just read was made in 1969, common ground. The fact of the matter is that there really was very, very little common ground. In the final analysis, the diplomatic agreement that would finally end the war was a product of and a reflection of what happened on the battlefield. And what happened on the battlefield was that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong won the war. Now, there are reasons for that also. I mean, the Americans, President Nixon, was withdrawing troops from Vietnam beginning in November of 1969. Beginning, in other words, just about 10 months after he was elected. Once we began to remove our troops, it was absolutely crystal clear to the North. Crystal clear, in other words, to our enemies. That time was on their side. And so they waited, they delayed, and eventually, of course, we had very, very few troops left there by 1972, and the North Vietnamese launched another invasion. Again, it's very, very complex. I don't have time to get into it right now, other than to say that the ultimate peace reflected the victory, the military victory, by the North and by the Viet Cong over the Americans and over the South Vietnamese.
1972, this day in history, President Nixon goes to Moscow, arriving there for a summit with Soviet leaders. He'd visited there before as vice president, that according to the History Channel. I want to get to Nixon's visits to China and his meetings with the Chinese, but also this. What was that about, this meeting with Soviet leaders in 1972 in Moscow?
The President Nixon had visited China the previous year, in 1971 and into 1972. And we call that using the China card. In other words, for many years, for about, from 1949 until that period, 20 or so years, the United States had not even recognized the existence of the communists in China. That changed. The Secretary of State at that time, Henry Kissinger, as well as President Nixon, made the decision to recognize the communists, pardon me, in spite of the fact that, Nixon had a reputation as being an old-line anti-communist. Well, what it did is it made international politics a little bit more complex than it had been before. Until 1972, 71, 72, international politics had basically been one side, namely us, against the other side, namely the Soviet Union. Now, all of a sudden, you had a third party there. And we were going to try to use a possible friendship, I don't want to call it an alliance because that would be too strong, but a relationship with China as a way to badger the Soviet Union. But by the same token, we would also use the Soviet Union against China because they were enemies. And Nixon's trip to the Soviet Union in May of 1972 was a part of that larger strategy to remind the Chinese that while we were kind of cozying up to them and we could utilize them, for instance, as a way of trying to pressure the North Vietnamese to settle the Vietnam War, by the same token, we could use the Soviet Union against China as a way of moderating Chinese influence in that general area of the world.
Why is communism different? And I do mean to get to today's current events, but a question for you there. Why is communism different in different communist countries? For example, you hear about a lot of cruelty in places like Cuba, North Korea, but you don't hear that about Vietnam and other communist countries today. Why is it not a uniform policy in all these different countries?
Well, it was never a uniform policy, and it was a real misunderstanding by American policymakers. And I'm talking about American policymakers going all the way back to 1917 when the Russian Revolution occurred, but especially after 1949, which was the year of the Chinese Communist Revolution. We assumed that all communism was monolithic. By monolithic, I mean it was all the same. It was all directed from the Kremlin in Moscow, that all communists, regardless of where they lived, whether they lived in Hornell, New York, or whether they lived in Beijing, China, would follow the Soviet line. But that did not take into account realities, not the least of which was the reality of nationalism. For instance, the Vietnamese communists were nationalists. They first were concerned about Vietnamese national interest, and secondly, they were concerned about communism. Now, I don't want to draw a huge distinction between these things, but the fact of the matter is that we never took into effect, old-fashioned national interest, national traditions, and so forth. The communists in China were first Chinese, and then they were communists. And until we understood that, and finally, I think it was Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, did understand that after 1969 and 1970 and 1971, when we did realize that we were able to separate those two countries and use one against the other. And I think that we did that reasonably well. But it took a long time, and it cost us many, many lives before we came to understand the distinction between communism on one hand and nationalism in each of these different countries.
And one more question on communism. What communist country has been the closest to what communist philosopher Karl Marx espoused?
Boy, that's a tough question in a way, because Marx himself did not take into account many of the distinctions. I suppose the answer would have to be the Russians. Okay, the Russian communists.
Lenin, would he be the closest?
Sure, except this, and I think that it kind of gives us a sense as to where we may have been going wrong. Marx said that if there was going to be a revolution, and he believed that a communist revolution would be inevitable, it was going to happen sooner or later, period. But those revolutions would occur in highly industrialized countries. Well, what did that mean? It meant England, it meant France, it meant Germany, it might mean the United States during that period of the American Industrial Revolution. So where does the first communist revolution occur successfully? In Russia, which is a country that was 90 to 95% agricultural. It was not an industrial country. And that should have alerted people to the fact that, that Marxist ideology was flawed, that Marxist ideology did not take into account local conditions that turned out to be absolutely critical.
We're talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're going to get to current events right after we take a break. 30 seconds. We'll check the forecast. We'll be back.
Selecting a nursing home for a loved one isn't easy until you've discovered Hornell Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation. Hornell Gardens delivers the highest level of care, compassion, and commitment with amenities and activities that will enrich body, mind, and spirit. It's a place that's close to home. Stop in for a tour of Hornell Gardens, located at 434 Monroe Avenue in Hornell, or to learn more, call 585-222-CARE or visit hurlbutcare.com.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carroll, who says it's going to be rainy at first and then it gets nice.
That's right, Brian. We start out with some rain today due to a frontal system crossing the region, and then once that frontal system moves east of the area, high pressure will build in behind it. That's going to set the stage for some very nice weather as we head through tomorrow and right through probably midday, if not afternoon on Saturday. So an extended period of nice weather shaping up for the region. Today, though, keep that umbrella handy. You'll need it. There'll be scattered showers throughout the day, maybe even a thunderstorm, 70 to 75. Sun came up this morning at 5:42. It'll set tonight at 8:32. We'll see scattered showers and perhaps a thunderstorm or two tonight, 50 to 55. They'll end late. Skies will then turn sunny tomorrow. It becomes warmer, high 75 to 80. Clear, cool tomorrow night, 45 to 50. Sunshine Thursday, 75 to 80. Friday, sunny and warm. And it should be partly sunny for much of Saturday, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back to Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Now getting to current events. This one not terribly pleasant. The school shooting down there in Texas. Dr. Ostrower, your thoughts?
Well, it's more of the same, and we can expect that this is going to be hardly the last of these kinds of shootings. Look, common sense, which isn't so common any longer, tells us that there should be some kind of control over weapons, whether we're talking about background checks, or we're talking about the size of magazines, or we're talking about banning assault rifles, which you do not need for hunting. We have to do more. I mean, there are going to be school shootings, as happened in Texas, which did not occur with the use of an assault rifle. But that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be more assault rifles used in school shootings. I read someplace, and I don't know whether this is accurate, but I read that since Newtown, since in 2013, there have been more children killed in schools as a result of shootings than there have been American GIs shot on the battlefield in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And if that's the case, then I think that we really have to do some another level of thinking about all of this. I just find that it's inconceivable to me that we're arguing that we should arm teachers instead of controlling the weapons themselves. An armed teacher, if there's a school shooting and a SWAT team comes into the school and they see a person, It could be a teacher, waving a pistol or waving a rifle. We have what we're going to call a dead teacher. The SWAT team is going to shoot first, and they're going to ask questions later. Arming teachers is not the answer. To have a guard at the gate, yeah, sure. I think that's fine. That's an excellent idea. But that's hardly a way to deal with a much more comprehensive kind of problem that we have over here. I just find it intolerable to think that we are still not taking common sense measures, such as enhanced background checks, to prevent this kind of thing.
What about the idea that the conservatives in New York State, in the state Senate, are putting forward on the Republican side of metal detectors at the door? Every student that walks through the door of whatever door they walk through goes through a metal detector.
They walk through, that's a lot of doors, a lot of metal detectors. We are not paying our teachers enough. There are teachers in Oklahoma, in Arizona, in West Virginia, in North Carolina, and eventually in other states as well, who are demanding, who are protesting in mass form for better pay. I was talking to a former student of my own, fairly recent, who's teaching down in Boca Raton, Florida. That's a high level, that's a high income community. It's the cost of living is relatively high in Boca Raton, in contrast, let's say, to Allegheny or Steuben counties up here. His salary is $42,000 a year. He's able to get along because he's single, but if he was married, either his spouse would have to work. If she had children, then they got to pay for daycare. In other words, I think we're not paying our teachers enough right now to put money into all of this fancy equipment that I do not believe is going to do the job. I think it does not make a great deal of sense. Let's take common sense. Okay, let's approach it in a way that that just tries to minimize the likelihood that these guys are going to have weapons that are going to kill large numbers of people instead of small numbers of people. But it's a pity that they would kill anyone. But I just think again that our fetish, our fixation on anti-gun control measures, our opposition to gun control, is historians years from now are going to scratch their heads and wonder why we did not take the obvious steps to reduce this kind of violence.
Moving on to the topic of China and trade. Here's what Senator Schumer is saying in the news today.
I say to President Trump, who knows I genuinely want him to succeed with China, stay strong. Don't back off sanctions on ZTE.
ZTE, the telecommunications giant there in China, President Trump kind of changed his position, saying that he wanted to help China and ZTE not lose jobs there. And Trump said the reason he's doing this is because there's ties between ZTE and American business. I'm guessing he's also doing it because Trump wants to keep on the good side of Xi Jinping in China so that he can use Xi Jinping for negotiations with North Korea and Kim Jong-un. Your thoughts, Dr. Ostrar?
I think that administration policy is not a policy. Right now, our trade policy in respect to China is all over the place. And it's, in part, it reflects the degree to which there are people in the administration who are very, very supportive of high tariffs on Chinese goods. There are others who want no tariffs on Chinese goods, and these people have not gotten their act together. And you have a president who, as I have said here before on previous Newsmaker programs, he does not read, he is not well informed, he acts on the basis of impulse, he acts on the basis of emotion, he has not thought through a policy, and consequently we really have no policy at all. And so what's happening with China, for instance, is that we're backing off the idea of tariffs against Chinese goods, and the Chinese are taking full advantage of the degree to which the administration is not very well organized on this. We have a fellow, for instance, by the name of Lightower, another one by the name of Peter Navarro. These are, Peter Navarro is the head of the Trade Council, the National Trade Council. He's a Trump appointee. He is very, very strong, very, very articulate on the idea that, yeah, we have to take strong action against Chinese goods as a way of saving American jobs. We have others U.S., not the least of whom is Steve Mnuchin, who is the Department, the Treasury Secretary. We have Larry Kudlow, who was recently appointed as a trade negotiator, not a trade negotiator, but an economic negotiator for the U.S., who believe exactly the opposite, that they believe in free trade, that we should reduce tariffs rather than increase tariffs, and that if we reduce tariffs, we're going to benefit. In fact, the entire globe will benefit from increased trade and therefore increased jobs. Well, both sides can't be right on this, and you got to have a policy, and you have to have a policy that the Chinese will understand. To the extent that there is no policy, the Chinese are playing off one of these groups in the administration against the other group in the administration, and consequently, all of Trump's campaign promises about a tough policy against China are not coming true. They're simply not being realized. And I would add one other thing, and this is one area where I think that Schumer is probably correct. We need China in order to put pressure on North Korea. Well, we're not going to get the Chinese putting pressure on the North Koreans unless we offer them concessions. And those concessions are going to be economic. Those concessions, of course, are going to be in the area of trade. And consequently, once again, the Chinese are taking advantage of Trump's inexperience. They're taking advantage of his ignorance. And they are going to, I think, ultimately prevail in this trade competition.
Dr. Ostrower, I only have about 30 seconds left. Quickly, China and intellectual property theft. Any thoughts there?
Well, I think that the U.S. has a strong case to be made that the Chinese ought to not require American companies doing business in China to reveal, to publicize their trade secrets. That is to say, to turn these trade secrets over to the Chinese. On the other hand, they have been doing this for decades, and other countries, by the way, have done some of the same. So one shouldn't get overly excited about the issue of intellectual property. Though I do think it's a real, I think we have a real complaint in that area.
Dr. Gary Ostrower, as always, thanks for coming in on a Tuesday.
Well, thanks for having me.
AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.